Got it.
Oh, night divine.
Very quiet. I like it.
Good morning. My name is Chris Shade, and as my friend Joe always says, it's good to be with you this morning. So we are glad to have the opportunity today to worship together and learn from God's Word. Before we start, though, I'm going to work my way backwards. I love this holiday season. I love Christmas. I like my wife who shared that on Wednesday. And just thinking about Christmas, what a privilege it is, if you think about it. This is one day of the year where much of the entire world stops from what they're doing. The secular world, the Christian world, stops life to celebrate Christmas. Now, granted, most people don't really necessarily know what they're celebrating, but they know it has to do with relationship and family and things of that nature. But I share that with you because as Christians, we've been given such a wonderful platform to speak the truth in the name of Jesus. I mean, where else can you go? I mean, you go to Walmart, and yes, they say Happy Holidays, and I say Merry Christmas. But what a great privilege that is. And I think as Christians, we need to really capitalize on that because it's not a gift. Christmas truly is all about. Guys, working backwards, Thanksgiving. You know, the older I get, and as many of you comment, I am getting older. And I appreciate that love and support. Just Thanksgiving continues to just resonate in my heart more and more as we know that, as Scripture says, every good and perfect gift comes from above. And so when we reflect on God's goodness and His faithfulness, we have a heart of gratitude. And gratitude is a form of worship. And so I love this holiday. I'm thankful that we have the opportunity. I'm thankful for the sacrifice of the pilgrims that they made to come here to be free to worship and the opportunities that we've been allowed and we need to preserve as we look to the future. But I'm going to read from you today as we come back to Thanksgiving from a book that we read from most every Thanksgiving. It's by Barbara Rainey. Most of you probably know Dennis Rainey. It's his wife. It's a family life book, Thanksgiving, a Time to Remember. And so, obviously, as we give thanks, we are remembering. But this is entitled Grumbling or Gratitude. And there's several scriptures he'll reference in here, but I think you'll enjoy this. So here's the little story I'll read to you. Does it ever seem surprising to you that God made the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years because they grumbled? My kids have spent 30 minutes in their rooms for griping, but 40 years? What a severe discipline. Ouch, that seems harsh. God clearly is not pleased with grumbling. It does not make him happy to hear his children complain constantly. Sound like any children you know? Being grateful is a choice. It is not a feeling dependent upon our circumstances, as we clearly see in the pilgrims' lives. They believed that God was in control. Providence, they call it. They circumstances with perspective that God has allowed this as written in his good word.
My strength indeed is small. Child of weakness, watch and pray. Find in thee thine all in all. Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt my heart of stone. Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand incomplete, Jesus died my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat, Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised his life up from the dead. Jesus paid it all. All to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. He washed it white as snow.
Good morning. Out of Matthew 28, verse 6. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said, come, see the place where he lay. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we're here this morning to just send praise and thanks for the work your Son did on the cross, where he died for our sins, and not only just died for our sins, but raised on the third day and beat death. There's I don't have any words for that because without that there's no reason for me to even be up here. We thank you, and in your name, amen.
was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry a kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met you. I was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my tomb till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all, and I know you're made new. Jesus, when I met you, you called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the way of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan. Now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing, and now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you called my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day.
Oh, Lord in heaven, what a privilege it is to stand here and sing before you about that glorious day. Lord, I'm just struck by the fact that we have trees all around our sanctuary in an effort to remember the season that we celebrate your birth. But Lord, it was a very different kind of tree that you hung on, that you shed your blood on, that you suffered in agony for, so that you might be put in that tomb, and you might blow the door of that tomb open so that we can stand before you clothed in the righteousness that you impart to us. Lord, we are forever grateful. We humble ourselves and we praise your name forever. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Please be seated. All right, we'll shift gears to our worship through giving and take a look at our financial update. And looking at the numbers there, you'll see for October we gave a little over $4,000 with $8,200 in expenses. November we're coming up on $2,900 with $6,700 in expenses roughly. And individuals in October gave 25 and 22 in November. And so I know that we take a look at in a lot of different ways, but you look at our Thrive goal, as we've talked, not just survive, but thrive, as Joe's been talking to us, 51 individuals giving $36 a week. So sometimes I think it's good to shake it up and take a look at it in different ways because it becomes more attainable. For the examples of one barista a day, that could be your tithing. So it adds up. So looking in your budgets of how you can accommodate that, and we do share a lot of the same information each week, but there is a purpose to it. As you know, it's a goal of ours to, again, not just survive, but to thrive. And we have had help through other ministries, which we give thanks for. But we're also growing in the sense of God's growing us as a church and giving us independence, just like a child growing. And so that's something we need to shoot for. I think it's a good goal for us to remember, and that happens in a couple different ways. One is just through us sacrificially giving what we can, and also just growing as a church. We're called to, we're commissioned to make disciples, and so as a part of that, guess what? We are ministering and discipling other people, and as they join us, that also enables us to financially survive too, as giving is a form of worship in that as well. So some different ways of looking at it. Don't want you just to think of this every month, every week when we go over it, shut your brain off for 5 minutes while we talk about finances, and then next week come back and do the same thing. So I think we just need to own that in different ways. And if any of that applies to you, then I hope that you take that with you. Missions giving, we'll take a look at that next. Again, we want to give and be models of giving as well. So Acts 29 for the year, $550, coming up on $2,200 for SBC and Converge, and then Lee and Regina Block a little over $1,800, which we celebrate. And I think it's nice too that we got to meet Lee and, Lord willing, Regina someday. We know those people we're investing in, and I think that's important. And as we think about it too, we're about ready to pray for, today we're going to pray for Converge. And I wish I had a picture. Maybe next time when I MC, we'll have a picture of them. But the people we're praying specifically with Converge are Jim and Laura Hayes from River Market Community Church in Kansas City. So I want to just, before we pray for them, I want to read a little bit. I was doing some research on their website, and I just want to read a little bit from their background, if you will, or who they are. So Jim and, again, Laura Hayes, and this is their opening statement, their opening paragraph and about who they are. They start off, "We are doing the last thing we thought we'd ever do. We're starting a church together. An odd mix of people scattered across the metro area, Kansas City, have come together for this endeavor with a variety of backgrounds, including addicts, drunks, thieves, adulterers, self-righteous pastors' kids, those darn rainbow and unicorn do-gooders, and lazy gluttons, with the founding pastor being an ex-drug dealer." Are you getting a picture of who we're supporting? "We all used to live, and sometimes still do, to glorify ourselves and to be our own gods. But we all encountered the gospel of Jesus, and it has changed our lives, some earlier in life, some later. The gospel is continuing to change us." So I hope that helps. These are the people we're supporting through our finances and our now too, and we're grateful to have that opportunity each week. So before we shift gears to meet and greet, forgive me, to give, back box by the Christmas tree, those are ways that you can give. So please make sure you do that. And we're going to pray for Jim and Laura and Converge Ministry, and then we'll do our little 3-minute break to meet and greet. So pray with me, please. Father, thank you for the opportunities for us as a church to bless others. Father, we have been so blessed by the prayer support, by the finances. So many ways, Lord, that other churches and individuals have supported us. So, Father, we lift up Converge as a whole, but specifically, Lord, Jim and Laura Hayes at River Market Community Church, Father. you can just tell in reading about them, they're sold out for you. There are no barriers. All are welcome and truly to come before and learn of who you are and be transformed by the gospel. So, Father, we lift them up that you would strengthen them in their ministry, give them endurance, give them hope, give them encouragement. We pray that you provide for their financial needs and their emotional needs too, Lord. Lord, as we learn about them, we want to know them. We want to support them. And, Father, we just thank you for that opportunity. So, Father, may you just bless Jim and Laura and their ministry there. And, Lord, today as they're worshiping, may they just feel your presence too. And so, Father, we give you thanks for the ways that you've enabled us to be the hands and feet for you, Lord. We lift up this church and this day of worship to you in your holy name. Amen. All right, get up, meet somebody, learn something new about somebody else. Find what they're doing for Thanksgiving, where they're going. Ask them questions. 3 minutes. Sorry to interrupt your time. Good morning. Thanksgiving. You're going to your house for Thanksgiving?
Good morning, everybody. You can tell we're getting off to a really good start. Y'all are ignoring me already. Man, it's good to be together with you guys. I know y'all love to hang out and chat and fellowship and talk, and that's good. I'm glad that we added this portion of time back to our Sunday gatherings. The opportunity to say hi to one another intentionally, to fellowship and meet people that you may not know and find out what you're doing for Thanksgiving. I don't know about you, but Thanksgiving, Christmas are probably my favorite season of the year. Number one, it is about Jesus for sure, and we have lots to be thankful for. Second to that is the food. The food. We're going to talk a little bit more about that here in just a few minutes. So if you just remember my love for food, you'll know when this comes back up. I do want to say thank you to Steph Shade and to Deb. Why am I forgetting their name? Dang, I feel horrible. Deb and Doug Ablett, just for putting together our Christmas party that we had this last Wednesday. The food was amazing, and that is not the connection to the food that I mentioned a little bit ago, but the food was amazing. The soup and the chili and the apple cider and all the cookies and the brownies and then decorating the sanctuary here, the gathering space. Just thankful for the work that Steph, you and Deb put in. So thank you. Let's give them just like a round of applause for their work. I know that oftentimes we come and we enjoy opportunities like that, and we forget how much front end and back end work that takes. And so just want to say thank you again. And man, it was a good turnout too. There was a good crowd of us, I think. And again, the food was amazing. Coming up, I want to give you a couple of announcements just to make you aware of that we think are important things that you might want to know are coming. First of all, a week from today, this next Sunday, on the 1st of December, just after Thanksgiving, right? 2 o'clock down at the Hastings City Auditorium, there's going to be a community praise and worship gathering. The Hastings Area Men of Promise are putting this on. They have a guest speaker coming from Kansas City. His name is Luther Eatman. He's a Kansas City pastor. And then there's also going to be music, a time of worship through music with a group called Music in Motion from here in the community. So this is an opportunity for all the churches to come together in one space, worship, hear preaching, and that kind of thing. So just want to encourage you, if that's something you'd like to do, you can talk with me afterwards and give you more details. But this next Sunday, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So you can come to church, gather with your home church that morning, go home, take a nap, and then get right back up and go do it again. And then if you're in a gospel community on Sunday night, you can go do that right afterwards. And you just get a full day of church. It'd be like old-time church revival all day long type of thing. So just want to encourage you to jump into that if you can. Also, you know the Christmas season is coming up. You see the Christmas trees. It's all over the radios. Even my TV in my home, we're already playing Christmas music on the music station all night long. It is that season. I want to get you updated with opportunities that you have here. First of all, after next Sunday, we're going to dive into a Christmas series in the book of, drum roll please, Luke. We're going to go into Luke. So some of you have been with us for a long time where we did the Gospel of Luke, preaching through that every Sunday, and we did that for like 3 years. It's a massive book. So for those of you that just grew through that and sat through that, we get to be in the Gospel of Luke for a Christmas series just for like 3 weeks. Part of that series and part of that season will also be our second annual, drum roll please, very good, Christmas Eve gathering. So this, because we're in a space, we're able to do that. So just want to get that on your radar that on Christmas Eve, we're going to do a big gathering here, and we'll sing lots of carols together, and we'll probably have some cookies and maybe some hot cocoa and apple cider, those kinds of things. And we'll hear from God's Word together, different readings. And it'll just be a quick gathering. I think last year we did about an hour. We'll probably do the same thing again. So I just want to invite you, even if you have family in town, grab your family, come and join us here for a Christmas Eve gathering. And then you can go home, wrap presents, stay up late, wait for Santa Claus, and so on and so forth. Should have time for that. Oh, a time. Yeah, you should have time for that. We're only doing an hour. I don't have a time yet, but we're going to get that. Yeah, sorry. Don't have a time set for it yet, but we will. So be on the lookout for that coming watch your emails, watch Facebook, listen as we continue to announce that in the future. So those are just some ways that we want to see you guys get connected through the Christmas season. It is a great season to be sharing and inviting others to get involved in the life of the church family. So those are just some quick announcements. I also want to connect you with a conversation that our elder team has been having. We're going to continue to have. If you can envision real quick a pot of water on a stove, and you're cranking up the burner so you can boil the water so you can cook some really good food, right? So that you can get some good nourishment, so that you can live well, and so this is food oriented once again, you'll notice, and this just keeps happening. And then so you can also just gather your family around the table to eat that soup, right? We just did that. So if you can envision that pot, you're cranking up the burner, you need to get the burner cranked up just hot enough so it's boiling just right, so it cooks the food just right? Because if it's not cooked good enough, you get malnourished, you get sick. If it's overcooked, blah, gross, right? So if you can envision that whole picture of that pot boiling and turn up that burner, what I'm trying to do right now is to continue to turn up the burner so that the pot is boiling. Now you might ask the question, what's in the pot, right? What's in the pot is what we refer to as our vision, our mission, our values, and our goals. That's what's in the pot. We're trying to boil that up so that it gets nice and flavorful, so that it helps to nourish us as a church, gather us together, and help us to grow in our community. And so I've got some slides that should be on the screen for us here in just a minute. And as you look at that, you see the three words up in what should be your left-hand corner. Somebody spout those three words off fast. Go. Man, y'all did that almost together. Give yourself a round of applause. That was good. Fruitfulness, ownership, connection. Those are the three words that I think right now, at least, are characterizing the whole conversation, okay? What we want to do is we want to develop a culture in our church family that is an ownership culture, that is hospitable, that is fruitful. So we want our church family to own this vision, mission, and values. We want our church family to grow in our ability to be hospitable in the neighborhood that we are setting up shop in. We want our church family to be owning this concept of fruitfulness, not only in our own individual lives, but in the lives of someone else, okay? So what that translates into is this vision, mission, and value statement that kind of helps us go, okay, this is what this looks like, right? And so you see this on the screen in front of you. As our elders have been cranking up this burner, this is what we came up with. We came up with this vision that we want to be a transformed family of missional disciples who exist for the glory of God and the good of the nations, okay? Now, all those words are super intentional, especially the word transformed family. If you took 5 different Christians and set them down around the table, I guarantee you would get 5 different definitions of what a transformed family looks like. If you took 5 different Christians and put them around the table and you asked them, what does it mean to be a missional disciple? You would get 5 different definitions. I'm certain of it. So what we're working on, and then even if you move into the exist for the glory of God, and what does it mean to be about the good of the nations, you get all these different definitions. Here's the good thing about that. In a community like this, you have how many churches? Quite a few, right? So each church is getting after those kinds of things in a different way that makes sense to them. Doesn't make any other church worse or less than or better than. It just means that's the flavor of the soup in the pot. Follow me? So we're trying to do definitions of all these things. That's how we're cranking it up. So you're going to hear lots about this as we continue to crank up that burner. Vision then leads into mission, because vision answers the question, who do we want to become? Mission answers the question, what are we doing? So that should be the next slide that you'll see in front of you as well. As we work through what it means to be a church that is on mission, here's how we're saying it. We're running a rescue mission within a yard of hell. I mean, it's tattooed on my arm, so we really can't get rid of that statement. We want to run a rescue mission within a yard of hell. We're not setting up a like a church with bells on top where everybody just comes and sings Kumbaya and we're all about us. We're trying to plant a church that is about God transforming us and then working through us to transform a neighborhood, a city, all the way to the ends of the earth. So running a rescue mission within a yard of hell, how are we doing that? We're doing that in 4 different ways. Proclaiming the gospel, planting members, which means members who actually get rooted in a church and call this their church family and their church home, and then training leaders up who are going to lead in that context, as well as then multiplying missionaries throughout the city to the ends of the earth. Now, when you hear the word missionary, you probably think of somebody like the Blocks, right? They're missionaries. We're supporting them to go do the missions work. I would argue, and I think our elder team would argue as we crank up that burner, that really we're all called to be missionaries, every one of us. The neighborhood you live in, the job that you work at, the grocery store when you go there, you're called to be a missionary who shares the gospel with people in those contexts. So we want to continue to crank up that kind of a burner. So that's vision, that's mission. Now you look at values. Values are the things that we say hold us together. We unite around these things. These are mountaintops that we would die on, okay? So the way that we communicate our values is that we are committed to and united by our commitment to gospel growth, family health, and mission engagement. Once again, what do those 3 things mean? That's what we're working on to get in front of you guys as time moves forward. We want to define clearly what we think gospel growth means, what we think family health means, and what we think mission engagement means to the best of our ability as we prayerfully think through it, as we search the scriptures. We want to put that before you guys. So please be praying for us as an elder team as we put those things together. What this winds up producing for us is a clear statement of here's some of the barriers in our church family. So then here's some of the goals, some barriers for growth. Have you ever noticed barriers for growth in your own life? When you think about how I want to get healthier, right? But there's a barrier to me becoming physically healthy, and the barrier is I sit around on the couch too much, I eat too many cheeseburgers. I could just make a list, right? And you can see it. So you have to get past those barriers so that you can begin to grow, which means you set goals. I'm going to eat less cheeseburgers. I'm going to quit sitting around the couch so much. Make sense? So as we boil this pot, what's happening for us as an elder team is we're figuring out some things that are barriers that are then going to create goals for us to pursue. And what we're going to do as time goes on is we're going to crank up the burner on just one of those goals for a certain period of time. And we're really just going to make it really, really hot so that we all start thinking in that vein and we all as a family start moving in that direction. So some of the barriers that we've noticed, and most of this is just I'll own all of it because I'm the lead planting pastor, meaning that for a long time it was just me leading, right? And so a lot of the barriers that we notice here in our church family has a lot to do with just the way that I lead. Lots of good things about the way that I lead, but there's also shadows, dark sides of the way that I lead that create some things. And so these barriers, I'll just own and say, hey, I'm cool with just saying this is probably a shadow side of the way that I've led for a long time, and here's some of the barriers that have been created because of that kind of leadership style. One is just investing in fruitlessness. For me, I think most people would say, dude, you got way too much patience. Too willing to just sit for a long time waiting and just waiting and waiting. And patience is good, but it can also create a culture where we just continue to invest in something that's not going anywhere. Second would be kind of a feeding consumers mentality that can get developed here. And part of that's just simply that a lot of people might look to a certain leader for a lot of help. And then kind of like when you go to see a counselor, which I've done many times in my life. But then I begin to see that counselor as just somebody that I'm always going to kind of suck off of, right? Going to consume something. But then I never figure out how to actually become a contributor in the midst of that. And so trying to make that balance out once again. And then third barrier I think that we're seeing is kind of an enabling inwardness, right? Which is kind of like when we sit down with each other and we start talking about our problems, we go, man, I'm in like 911 mode, right? And you put out the fire. We start doing that, it becomes a real inward focus very quickly. When you think about this, like when you're sitting down with a doctor, and the doctor goes, hey, you're sick this way. You go home, you start taking meds, you kind of shut yourself off, you isolate from the outside world so nobody else gets sick. This happens inside of a church family really, really easily, and it's not like any of us would ever intend to do that, but we wind up enabling an inwardness that happens, and what we need to do is we need to cultivate connection in our community. So Those are some of the goals. Invest in investors, people who want to actually invest in their own growth and the growth of others. We also want to equip and empower owners. Like at the end of the day, this church is not mine, doesn't belong to me. Now, my daughter Charity asks me this quite often. She's like, don't you own the church? Aren't you the boss? I'm like, no, I'm not. Actually, I just get to stand on the stage. And so it's an easy thing for us to kind of make a mistake on that somehow I own that. I don't. We all own this, right? So equip and empower owners, and then finally cultivate that connection with one another. So we want to do everything we can to boil up those goals one at a time in the near future and just start seeing a culture shift take place. So I want to wrap all this up by saying two things. If you wanted to make this really practical for you in your seat, like you be asking the question, okay, Joe, how do I get after this, right? Me as an individual, how do I lean into where it seems like the Holy Spirit through our elders may be leading us? That'd be the question you should be asking. It's a question I'm hoping you're asking, right? How can I be a part of that? Two things that I think. Two questions. One's a question, the other one's a statement. And the statement is going to be where the food comes back in. So just hang in there. The question is who's your one? Ask that question. Who's my one? Who is the one person that you are investing in from a discipleship standpoint that is not part of your gospel community and not part of your family? Who's your one? Who's the one person that's on your list that you're getting after? And you're like, hey, you know what? Jesus loves you. Like, he died on a cross for you. I don't know what's happening in your life, but I want to walk with you through that. I want to help lead you to Jesus. Who's your one? There needs to be somebody in that spot of your one, outside of your family, outside of this church family even, and outside your gospel community. Somebody out in your workspace, your school space, your family space that's outside this family, this church family. So who's your one? Be asking that question. Finally, the food connection. Some people will ask, like, okay, what does it actually mean to make disciples? What does it look like to make disciples? Here's the way we would say it. Some of you will really get this. We like to say that we want to make fat Baptists. Sinking in, right? Fat Baptists. All right? Fat Baptists. We do this really, really well when it comes to potlucks and food that we eat at GC and so on and so forth. Fat Baptists. It's actually as funny as it may sound, it's actually an acronym, FAT. Faithful, available, and teachable. That's the kind of disciples that we want to make. Faithful, available, and teachable. When any one of those three pieces is missing from a disciple's life, then that disciple becomes very anemic. Follow me? So here's the thing. You can't give what you don't have. If you're not faithful, if you're not available, if you're not teachable, how are you going to make disciples who are ever that as well? And so I think it's a good challenge for us to say, hey man, am I a fat Baptist or not? Like, I am. I know I am. I know I am. I know that Seth is not in terms of physical appearance. But these would be good measuring rods for our discipleship, our own growth. Measure yourself that way and then say, can I hand this on to someone else? And if not, then you need to figure out what you need to do to get there, right? That's on each of us to own that. We can't expect somebody else to make us faithful. We can't expect somebody else to make us available. We can't expect somebody else to make us teachable. We own that. So I just want to challenge us that way. Those are two ways. Become a fat Baptist who has one name on your list. Got it? Good? All right, I want to move us into the book of Joshua. If you would stand with me, we're going to be in Joshua chapter 9 this morning. Joshua chapter 9. Have enjoyed this study. I'm praying that the Lord comes and meets us here today. Trust that He's going to. Joshua chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. Follow along with me. As soon as all the kings who were beyond the Jordan, in the hill country and in the lowland, all along the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites heard of this, and they gathered together as one to fight against Joshua and Israel. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they on their part acted with cunning and went and made ready provisions. took worn out sacks for their donkeys, wineskins, worn out, torn, and mended, with worn out patched sandals on their feet, and worn out clothes. And all their provisions were dry and crumbly. They went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us." But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, "Perhaps you live among us. And how can we make a covenant with you?" And they said to Joshua, "We are your servants." And Joshua said to them, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" They said to him, "From a very distant country your servants have come because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him and all that he did in Egypt and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and to Og king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, 'Take provisions in your hand for the journey and go to meet them, and say to them, "We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here is our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it is dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey." So the men took some of their provisions, but did not ask counsel from the Lord. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. At the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them. The people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Chephirah, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. The people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then all the congregation murmured against the leaders. And all the leaders said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Now we may not touch them. This we will do to them. Let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because of the oath that we swore to them." And the leaders said to them, "Let them live." So they became cutters of wood and drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said of them. Joshua summoned them, and he said to them, "Why did you deceive us, saying we are very far from you when you dwell among us? Now therefore you are cursed, and some of you shall never be anything but servants, cutters of wood, and drawers of water for the house of my God." They answered Joshua, "As it was told to your servants for a certainty, that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you, and did this thing. And now behold, we are in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to us, do it." So he did this to them, and delivered them out of the hand of the people of Israel, and they did not kill them. But Joshua made them that day cutters of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord to this day in the place that he should choose. Father, we do ask a blessing over your word. Lord, help our hearts to be open and receptive to what you would speak to us today, trusting that the words of this book are not just the words of men, but they're the words of men as they were carried along by your very Spirit to write. Therefore, we trust that these are your words. So help us to be open and receptive. Lord, we pray that you would remove any spiritual hindrance in our midst. All of the unseen, invisible things in our midst that we cannot see, that would be like barriers that would prevent us from hearing from you, God, please remove those. We trust that that work is something you are more than capable and able of doing because you left the tomb empty that we sang about today. And so we pray, Father, that you would do that and that you would come and do a work of transformation in our hearts this morning through the preaching of your word. And I pray finally, Father, that you would take the words of my mouth and the motivations and the intentions of my heart, and that you would purify them in these moments, that I might bring you honor and glory, and that what I say would be helpful to your people who are gathered here. So pray that, trusting you to do that work. And all God's people said, amen. You may be seated. As I studied this chapter this week, came across a statement that should be on the screen for you here in just a moment. Commentator and author, as he studied through this, makes this statement. He says, there are no spiritual advances, personally or corporately, that will happen without challenge and conflict. And just think about that statement for a minute. No advances spiritually that we're going to make at the personal level or the corporate level that are going to be made without some kind of challenge and conflict. So the reality is that the Christian life is about spiritual advancement in a physical world, right? It's about spiritual advancement in a physical world. In other words, if you want to follow Jesus in this world, then you really should expect to face opposition and challenge, deception even. The problem is that when we talk about opposition, when we talk about advancement, when we talk about challenge, when we talk about these things, we live in a physical reality. But we really need to be thinking and talking about them in an invisible nature. And there's just a disconnect for us because we're physical, right? So a disconnect happens. I'm going to pick on this, what I picked on last week, consumerism. We talked about it. We've been talking about that in some of our mission and vision stuff. Consumerism is really one of those invisible enemies. I confronted it quite a bit last week, I think. You could easily add a bunch of other isms that are invisible as well in many regards. Materialism, capitalism, right? Nationalism, individualism, lots of isms you could add to the list. All of those enemies are basically invisible enemies that seek to deceive you and seek to oppose the work of the Word of God in our lives. But the question is, regardless of which invisible enemy it is that's after you, that has a hold on you, the question is, how would you even recognize it? It's invisible. How would you realize when you have actually made some sort of an agreement or pact or covenant with some invisible enemy? Okay? So how would you know if you had gotten into bed with some invisible enemy in your life? Graphic way of asking the question. The reason I ask that way is because it begets a certain kind of intimacy that happens between you and that invisible enemy. Intimacy then is what connects you to that enemy, and you're so entangled with it that it's hard to even know that you are. So how would you even know if you are an invisible enemy? About this. Once you actually realize that you are, when you clearly realize it and you see that for what it is, what are you going to do? Once you recognize, hey man, there's an invisible enemy that's gotten a hold of me. I've made an agreement with it. I'm in bed with this thing and I need to get it dealt with. How are you going to deal with it? What are you going to do in those moments? How are you going to resolve the problem? How will you move forward in becoming a Christ follower who worships God in spirit and in truth? How will you do battle with an invisible enemy in a world that values visible results? How will you do this? Question. I would suggest the story that we see here in Joshua chapter 9 is very helpful in this regard, because in this story what we see, and you may not have caught it, but what we actually see happening in this story in Joshua chapter 9 is an age-old conflict. It's an age-old conflict between God and Satan. And it's just erupting again between God's people and her enemies. What we see here in this chapter is a very visible portrayal of the Gibeonite deception, right? Gibeonites come and they deceive Israel and her leaders. That story is actually a continuation of an invisible battle between God and Satan that erupted back in the Garden of Eden, if not even previously before that, depending on your theology. And it will continue until the second coming of Christ. That's the two poles at either end. A little bit about Satan. Satan is actually not Satan's name. It's just an interesting little concept. If you do the work, it's actually a title. Satan is actually the Satan. He's nameless. God's enemy is actually nameless. Thus, Satan actually means deceiver, opposer, okay? Enemy. So Scripture describes the Satan as the father of lies, as the accuser of God's people, as the lion who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And in many other ways, but at the end of the day, the Satan is just a big kitty on a leash that is held by the sovereign hand of God. So even though this opposer, this accuser, this father of lies, this lion, even though he comes and opposes God's work in and through me, he does that in such a way that he tries to chop me down, right? You might have experienced, tries to chop you down like a weak little sapling. The reality is that he is just a tool in the hands of a sovereign God who then uses his own enemy and opposer to simply chop away the deadness in your life so that you can become more of a strong oak tree, right? That's actually the picture theologically of this cosmic battle between God and his enemy that we see erupting in this passage. Let me think for a minute about the opposition that you face in your life. Think about the things that you have faced. Think about that. Look back at the text, verses 1 through 2. What do we see? We see national opposition, right? There's a national opposition happening here. All the kings of the land have heard about what the Lord was doing in and through the nation of Israel. Agreed? Back in chapter 5, if you look back at chapter 5, you'll notice that those kings' hearts had melted like hot butter, right, out of their fear. And they just kind of isolated themselves and they were hiding from Israel and Joshua. Their livelihoods were in danger. That's the reality. Their livelihoods were in danger. So, motivated by a very invisible enemy, what did they do? They hid out. What was the invisible enemy of these kings? They had a grip on their soul. Fear. Maybe many other things, but that's one that I noticed right away in the text. They were afraid. That invisible enemy motivated them. So, what do they do now? Kings of the land mount this united national opposition against Israel. Right? That's what we see in the first couple of verses. What you see here in the trajectory of the text, the trajectory of the story, is that what begins as maybe one or two enemies early on easily and very quickly multiplies into an overwhelming, outright assault that, if I was standing there, might completely demoralize my heart. And isn't that the way it oftentimes happens for us? What begins as something very small winds up multiplying to something huge that just feels like it's going to devastate us. We can't get past this, right? I mean, I imagine being in Joshua and Israel's shoes. Can you imagine that? Maybe imagine this in your own context, right? You pick up the phone, which sometimes is scary to do when someone calls. You pick up the phone. Doctor on the phone tells you that what appeared to just be some simple abnormality now is actually a life-threatening illness, right? Something that started out very small, now is something huge that you can't even see how you're going to get past it. The job that you had that was barely paying the bills lays you off for the holidays. Something that was small, it was an issue, became massive. Not sure how you're going to get past this. A sinful addiction, maybe. Keeps knocking on your front door, keeps knocking it down. You finally got that door barricaded, right? Doing everything you can to live in some kind of purity and faithfulness to the Lord. You feel like you got that little thing kicked, and somehow it finds its way in through the side door again, and it brings friends. Something that was hard, but it seemed kind of small, multiplies into this massive opposition that you can't seem to get around. And it's all in the physical realm, right? Fixated on it. Can't get past it. You thought that your marriage or some other relationship that had gone through this season of difficulty, you thought it had finally recovered from that. And then suddenly you realize that underneath everything, it hadn't recovered, and it's broken beyond repair, right? Something that seems small, maybe even gone away, that you kicked its butt, comes back to get you. Like Joshua and Israel, you might see it this way. You might see that you've fought really hard to weather the opposition in the physical realm with all of your enemies, whatever they may be. And then suddenly, it's kind of like you wake up or something, and you find out that all of your enemies are united, and they're coming against you. And you can't get your eyes off of that enemy. It's all you can focus on, right? The broken marriage, the addictions, the lack of money, the job, whatever it may be. You can't get your eyes off it because whatever it is, it's way too big for anything else to get in. And you're locked on that thing. I would reverse that and say that thing is actually locked on you. You're so focused on it to the extent that you totally miss the invisible enemy that has snuck right into your heart. Set up shop inside of your heart. Which is what you see happening next in our text, verses 3 through 15. It's a visible enemy, but there's something invisible happening, right? As the Gibeonites sneak into the camp. And you think about this, Joshua has just gathered the Israelites in a valley back in chapter 8. He's gathered them in a valley after their victory over Jericho, after their victory over Ai. They've gathered there for this old-fashioned praise and worship service, right? And the praise and worship service was complete with a highly visible portrayal of the blessings of the sacrifices for the curse of sin. Altar in the middle, bloodbath. Worshiping on either side of that in front of a mountain of destruction and then a mountain that is beautiful and fruitful. It's all visible. Talk about a spiritual high, right? Kind of like youth camp. Gathered in a valley, singing songs. There's a bloody altar in the middle. Next thing that happens, though, in the midst of all that, Fox News or CNN, pick on both sides fairly, or some other variation of some social media outlet that broadcasts its message of fear. In case you haven't noticed, all of them seem to do that really well. Broadcast this message of fear regarding the national opposition that is coming down the pipe, right? And you get all up in arms and you run out and you do some things. You see the impossibility of the oppression and the opposition that is coming against you. It captures your heart. It captures your mind. You can't get away from it. It's all you think about. Then out of the corner of your eye, you catch some movement, right? And you go, what is that? What is that thing? Is that another enemy? You kind of brace yourself maybe for what's coming. You go, oh, it's kind of some worn out issue and nagging me in the back of my mind for a while. In these moments, what happens? Enter the Gibeonites, this invisible enemy, invisible deception. What do you do with this? When you recognize that, well, what do you do with it? What does Joshua and Israel do with it? I mean, look at the Gibeonites for a minute back in your text. Think about them for a moment. What do you see? In the physical realm, what do you see? You see some worn out clothes. You see some dried up, moldy old food. They look like foreigners. Probably not going to be a big deal, although in our culture, when we think about foreigners, we get afraid. Where did they come from? What do they want? They've heard about your God, they say. They've heard how he destroyed your other enemies. They don't want to face the same fate. They want to serve you. Got to love how like slide in. Oh, let me help. Let me be your servant. The way that our enemies oftentimes give us. You somehow serve your deep desires. They want to serve you in exchange for their safety. Seems reasonable, seems harmless. You make an agreement with them for their preservation. What happens in the passage, right? Now, if you were to flip forward into Joshua chapter 10, verse 2, you would notice, and the other pastor Joe's going to preach this next week, but you'll notice in that verse that the Gibeonites are actually a very sizable, very formidable enemy. They are a large nation of cities. They had well-trained warriors. But here's what happened. Instead of a full frontal attack like the other nations were planning together, this enemy decides to play in the realm of invisible deception so that they can stay alive and exert their influence. That's important. I don't have time to go into it. Part of the Old Testament law actually gives lots of provision for this. I'll mention it again here in a moment. But the driving force behind the Old Testament law that gives provision for how to handle a situation like this is simply to keep yourself pure and unstained from the influence of the world that we live in. The question is, how do you do that? How do you live in a physical reality while growing spiritually? How do you be in the world but not of it? The most popular way for Christians in our culture is to make war with it. It's the most popular way. Agreed? We make war with the culture. Because that's what Jesus did, right? Thought to think through. Played in the realm of invisible deception to stay alive and exert its influence. Now, historically, again, God did give some instructions for how to relate to their enemies that were distant from them. You can check this out in Deuteronomy 20, verse 10 through 18, and in Numbers 27 through 21. The basic instruction of those two passages put together is this: don't pick a fight with them. Live at a peaceable distance from them after you sought the Lord's voice as to whether or not they are a threat to you. Okay? That's the basic summary. I spent a lot of time there, but don't have time. Go check it out. But the problem in this current passage that we're in is what? What's the problem? The problem is, according to verse 14, if you look back, it is that Joshua and Israel never sought the Lord. They looked like they were, didn't they? They appeared as though they were. I mean, this is just right after a massive worship gathering in the valley. You would think that they would actually seek the Lord on this matter, but what do? They don't. They actually rely on what? Their physical senses rather than their spidey senses. No, their physical senses, right? What they could see, what they could taste, what they could touch, what they could smell, what they could hear. Physical realm. They're picking up weapons of warfare according to our physical existence rather than weapons of our warfare that are according to our spiritual walk. That's what they did. And don't we do this too? Don't we, if we're honest? One author says this. He says that if your enemy cannot kick in the front door, he will slip in through the side door to compromise your trust and obedience to the Lord. Can't come in through the front door. Come in through the side door. What does this look like in your life? Would you be willing to go there and ask the question, who has snuck in through the side door visibly and has influenced my heart? I mean, you've experienced this many in different ways. Maybe you face down one massive, scary enemy all day long, whatever it may be. You get home, you tune out behind the TV, right? Your marriage, some other relationship goes through this fiery test, so you renew your commitment to attending church gatherings, right? Your kids rebel, so you got to get them back in youth groups so that you can get them fixed, right? None of those resolutions are necessarily bad at all. In fact, on the surface, they're probably very, very good, but somewhere in the corner of your mind's eye, what happens is you actually make an agreement with some invisible enemy like comfort, or an invisible enemy like consumerism. And then at some point, what you realize is that even though you're doing some really good things, as it appears on the surface, the physical realm, somewhere silently in the background, in the darkness, this invisible enemy has set up shop in the midst of your heart. The only reason that you actually watch TV is to escape into comfort, and the only reason that you actually go to church is to fix some big issue inside of you or your spouse or your kids. And then what happens? The awakening happens. You wake up to that moment and you go, holy smokes. That's if God's grace and mercy and kindness shines down upon you, right? Because if you never wake up to that moment, then what lies ahead of you? So if you wake up to that moment and you go, man, I'm in bed with a silent, deceptive, destructive enemy. It's God's kindness towards you. What will you do with that moment when that awakening happens is the question. Would you ignore it and walk away? This is what happens in verses 16 through 21. There's a moment of realization. An awakening takes place for Joshua and Israel. For us, someone preaches a message. Or you see a passage that pops up on your Bible app. Or a friend confronts you. Or God speaks to you in a dream. Or you where you wake up to the horrifying reality that you've made some agreements with some very invisible, very deceptive enemies, and they've set up a sweatshop in your heart, an idol factory in the center of your soul. You wake up to that. It's a moment of realization where you recognize that you've actually made decisions on the basis of moldy bread rather than seeking the Lord's direction for your life. It's the moment that you realize that you've walked by sight and not by faith. And because of this, you're now in bed with an invisible enemy that's been deceiving you for longer than you can imagine. Moment of awakening. It's the moment that you realize that comfort is actually your God. It's the moment that you realize that consumerism is actually your master. Or where you realize that individualism is your slaveholder, or that nationalism is your boss, or that capitalism has crept in and it won't leave you alone. What do you do now when you recognize that? What do you think Israel does on the day that they woke up to the reality of the Gibeonite deception? Well, if you look back at the text, you see, number one, that Israel doesn't go ballistic. They don't lose all over the place. They don't attack their enemies in some unbridled way, although they want to. Right? They don't take to Facebook to whine about the mess they got themselves into, because that's the way it would always be victim language. I'm going to whine about the mess I got myself into and blame it on somebody else for the reason that I'm here. Hello. They don't, although they do complain. They do complain against their leaders because we love to do that. Again, it's somebody else's fault. Our leaders got us here. We didn't get us here. They do whine against their leaders for holding them accountable to their commitments. At the end of the day, Israel and her leaders decide to honor their agreement for the sake of the Lord's honor. So this is the beginning of the resolution of conflict here. That's the beginning of it. In this final portion of the text in verses 23 through 27, we see simply the resolution of conflict. This is an important moment. When you think about resolving conflict, let that sink in for a second. The resolution of conflict. Conflict is actually a very important thing. It's not a bad thing. Oftentimes we look at it as though it's something really, really bad. Conflict's not necessarily bad. A lot of growth happens in the midst of conflict. Things are rubbing against each other. But resolution is important in conflict management. Oftentimes we think the resolution of conflict means the conflict goes away. Not necessarily true. I don't think that that's really the way we ought to look at it, at least from a biblical mindset. If you want to get into a bunch of psychobabble, maybe, right? But from a theological standpoint, I'm not sure the Bible would necessarily support that idea that resolution to the conflict means the conflict goes away. I think if you look throughout Scripture, you would see that resolution is important in conflict management because resolution brings purpose to the tension. Resolution brings purpose to the tension. There's a kind of tension between the legitimate need for something on the one hand, like comfort or security. There's a legitimate need for that on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the abuse of that natural need that quickly dissolves into a desire that gets overindulged. Tension between that. That's where I think, again, resolution brings purpose to the tension between those two poles. So if what I'm saying here maybe like just it's way over our heads, it's not, think about this in a practical sense, okay? If I suddenly realize that I became part of a church because of my out-of-control desire to consume another product or experience, how do I resolve that and bring purpose to that? Because being a part of a church isn't bad. How do I resolve it? I could resolve it, bring purpose to that conflict, just by simply realizing that I am not only a consumer, but I'm also called to be a contributor. I am a consumer of God's grace and God's mercy. Can't stop, that's good. But I'm also to be a contributor. So now it adds tension between those two poles. And you got to live in that tension for there to be growth that happens, right? So that would be one way of describing what I'm talking about. Take this down to a more personal level. If I wake up to the realization that I only got married because of some desired benefits, you can check whatever box you want in your mind. Because some desired benefits, how do I resolve that conflict and bring purpose to that tension? I could do that by simply remembering that I am called to serve my spouse rather than use my spouse for my own agenda. That would bring purpose to the tension there. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that resolution is important in conflict management, because resolution brings purpose to tension. That this is exactly what happens at the end of this story. Now turn your attention back to the story. Joshua confronts the deceptive Gibeonites for their lies, right? And then in this radical turn of events, they entrust their lives to Joshua, whose name means God saves. They entrust their lives to Joshua as their deliverer. In the end of the story, catch this, in the end of the story, God's enemies become the hospitality team in the temple. So I want to spin this into a missional aspect for a moment. Who is it that you think could never step foot in here because they are too sinful? Whoever that is for you, I just want you to know whoever they are, could be the hospitality team. But the pathway for them to get there completely relies on the sovereignty of God, but He chooses to use you as the vehicle for that. The question is, are you a usable vehicle? Right? The Gibeonites are much like Rahab in this story. Lots of connections between this story and Rahab, and I don't have a lot of time to go there. Out of time. Way out of time. When you think about this, liars, prostitutes, enemies of God, that's the story. They're not really good people in any way. Get transformed into worshipful servants of the rescuer. Interesting to note this too, that the Gibeonites, later on in the biblical story, they are responsible for the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem years later in Nehemiah chapter 7. This is long after the story of Joshua. You go through the entire period of the Judges where everybody does what is right in his own sight. Guess where that gets them? We've all been there, right? Long after that, the city is destroyed. The Gibeonites are highly responsible for the rebuilding of that destroyed city. but a miraculous resolution that brings purpose to the tension. Right? The resolution of the conflict of this story, what it does, it reveals God's purpose in shaping all of us into worshipers of Him. That's the point of all of this. So I'm going to say it again. The point of all this is making us into worshipers of Him. I want to rail on this again. The songs we sing, that's not worship. All by everything we do is worship. It seemed like, man, it's a thing, Joe, to pick on. Think of the silent enemy that gets a hold of our hearts in the midst of that. We begin to think that songs are our worship, but not everything else. I mean, David is very clear in the Psalms that he worships while reading God's Word. What does that mean? Does that mean he's singing songs? Well, in one regard, yeah, because it's the Psalms, right? When you're studying God's Word, it's worship. When you're serving somebody, it's worship. When you're eating food at home with your family, it's worship. When you're looking at the computer, it's worship. When we're praying, when we're taking communion, it's all worship. This is something that I think is happening in the American church that we have failed to get away from. It's a language barrier that allows some silent enemy to get in. It forces us to think, well, for half an hour on a Sunday morning, I'm going to worship God through these songs. What about the rest of our week? It creates consumers rather than contributors. When you begin to understand that the way that you walk through that door in the morning, you are making a contribution to the worship of a church family. Changes things. Radically changes things. It might seem small, but it's not small. So, purpose of this passage, object of our worship. That's really, if you're going to continue to drill down, it's the object of our worship. What do you worship? Who do you worship? See, it's always been about the object of our worship, going all the way back to the beginning in the Garden of Eden, right? It was about the object of Adam and Eve's worship. Back to when the Satan fell from heaven, it was about the object of his worship. Who was the object of Satan's worship? Himself. Keep that thought in your mind for a moment. Come back to Israel. The issue is about Israel's worship. Who are they going to trust? Who are they going to obey? Who's going to be at the center of their lives? By way of application, last week once again, the end of Joshua 8, I hammered away. You have continued to hammer away again. And an invisible enemy that I believe is absolutely deadly, called consumerism. I keep coming back to that word. Probably making some of you really uncomfortable. Tired of hearing it, maybe. Consumerism is an invisible motivation of the heart that moves us into patterns of consuming one product or experience after the next in our quest to satisfy a deep hunger or a deep thirst in our souls. This time of the year is a year where I believe that sleeping giant, so to speak, that invisible enemy gets awakened in full force. I mean, I can't tell you how many Black Friday commercials I saw this week. And I'm thinking about, man, what could I get? Why? Got everything I need. I don't need any more guns. I don't really need a new truck. I want one, but I don't need one. Bigger house would be great. You see, you just start thinking about these things. It's so easy, isn't it? Something thirsting and hungering inside of me that gets awakened by this. Now, I referred to consumerism last week as a worship disorder that can only be remedied by coming under the rule of our rescuer at the cross of Calvary. Again, you still may wonder what this has to do with you. You might even be tempted to think that because you're here today, you are obviously exempt from the clutches of consumerism, which makes you better than me, which is okay. But at the same time, you might also wonder what consumerism and the study of Joshua actually have in common. Right? That's the question I would be asking in the audience if I heard a pastor preaching this way. I'd be like, what does consumerism actually have to do with Joshua? I don't see the word there. I mean, Joshua appears to be a book on the surface that is centered on Israel's physical conquest of the Promised Land, right? Be sure that's the narrative of the book. Then the question becomes this: would you actually do better to apply the narrative of this book to some other visible enemies that we see in our world? That's the common evangelical Christian approach. We're going to apply the narrative of this story, all the physical things we see in our world. You need to be Joshua. Lead your people against all the bad things in this world. Agreed? This is common narrative in the church today. Might I say, think that God might judge the church for taking that stance from this passage and from the book of Joshua? I would be bold enough to say that. Read through the prophets and see the way that God judges, not typically all those nations out there doing all those bad, horrible things, judging his people, church. Okay? So I don't think that we should be talking about how to leverage all of our physical resources, our time, our talent, treasure for the advancement of God's spiritual, this highly politicized world. Why would I continue to take aim at something like consumerism when there's tons of other worthwhile economies in the world around us? I've already kind of given you the answer. Here's another answer to that. Consumerism, while invisible, leaves an absolutely visible path of destruction behind it. A consumerism is similar to a termite in its invisible nature. The effects of consumerism, like the termite, actually, weaken and erode the spiritual lives of believers within a church community, which then weakens the power of that church in that community. Same as in a marriage. I think that consumerism may very well be one of the most devastating enemies of the church today, especially in the American culture, because consumerism, I believe, is one of the most deeply held values of our nation. The real danger for us, I think, lies in our bent towards fighting enemies in the physical realm with physical weapons rather than in the spiritual realm with spiritual weapons. And here's what we do. We dress it all up in some really cute spiritual language, while at the same time we totally miss the hold that our invisible enemies have upon our hearts. So the question is, how deeply do you think that an invisible enemy like consumerism hammered one enemy? Because it's good to hammer away on one. There's a bunch of others, right? How deeply do you think that one has a hold on you? If America really is infected with that invisible poison, then how much of your heart has been shaped by that value? Because then what you worship, the way that you worship, the object of your worship changes, right? And the question again, how would you even know if your life was infected with that poison? Dressed up in religious language. Think about the struggles you face for a moment. Think about the things that bother you the most: fear, loneliness, discontentment, worry, laziness, addictions, overworking. What is your struggle? And what's at the center of your struggle when you think about whatever your struggle is? What's at the center of it? I better yet ask this question: who's at the center of your struggle? Right? Who's at the center? How surprised would you be if you stripped all of your struggle? If you could take the struggles that you have, you could strip them away and you could set them on a plate over here, and you strip them away from all the religious languages you use to describe them. If you did that work, would you be surprised to find yourself standing at the center of your existence where the Son of God belongs? So the Christian life is about spiritual advancement in a spiritual or in a physical reality. There are no spiritual advancements personally or corporately that will happen without challenge, conflict. If you want to follow Jesus in this world, then you should expect to face opposition and deception. The Christian who desires comfort in the church doesn't really desire to be like Christ. Jesus, in conclusion, left the comforts of heaven. That's the Jesus I know. He left the comforts of heaven to come to this sin-stained earth to rescue you. He was beaten nearly to death. He was nailed to a cross on a lonely hilltop. He was crucified alone between two criminals. His friends abandoned him in his hour of greatest need. He was dead before sundown. He got tossed in a borrowed grave. And he did this because you and I love to serve ourselves, just like the Gibeonites did. He did this so that by God's grace, you may come to him in faith, so that he might forgive your sin. Okay? His body was broken, his blood was poured out so that consumers like you and I could become contributors to the power of the empty tomb. That's the message of the gospel that finds its way all throughout the scriptures. Here's the reason that he did this. Similar to what Chris read earlier from my friend Jim's website. He did this so that liars and beggars and thieves and prostitutes and any other outcast that you can put a name on come and be transformed members of the family of God. Jesus is meant to be the object of our worship. And the question is are you convicted that maybe you've made yourself the object of your worship? And if that's you, if you're in that place, then here's what you may do. You may cast yourself upon him, just like the Gibeonites did with Joshua, and you may say, I am in your hand. Whatever seems good and right in your sight to do to me, do it. That's trust. And what I know to be true, and what many of us in this room know to be true, is that when you do this, Jesus will be faithful to make you into a transformed worshiper of him in spirit and in truth. A person who has been transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might give yourself away in worship, not just during the closing songs of a service, but for the rest of your life. Amen? Let me pray. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, as we close today, I pray that you would help us to meet you. In fact, I pray, Father, that you would come and meet us in some very special ways as we close. That you would turn our hearts and our minds to the work of your Son, Jesus, at the cross in the empty tomb. That you would remind us that your body was broken and your blood was shed on our behalf. Lord, help us to recognize that you've given everything that you had for us so that we could come to you as the real beggars that we really are, with the real worn-out clothes that we really have, so that you might take those filthy rags, worn-out clothes that are stained with sin, and you might replace them with robes of righteousness. I help us never to forget, Father, that you haven't done this just for us, but you've done this for many more. People that we may never think would come close to you. I pray that you would do that work in us this morning. Trust you to do it. Lord, we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Listen, as we close, a couple of things. You'll notice the front has changed, not just for the purpose of just merely liking change, but although change is transformation, but change is good. Move this bench in here because we felt like maybe it would be good to offer a space of an altar where you could kneel down and pray if you felt like you need to. Like maybe as you're meeting with the Lord, you need to get into a bowed posture before him, a posture of surrender, where you say, I'm actually kneeling down in a posture of surrender as I give myself away to you, Lord, because you gave yourself for me. So that's what this bench is here. We do communion together every week to remember the work that Jesus did at the cross, body broken, blood poured out. 2 stations on either end of the bench and 1 station underneath the big clock back there. We'll have people at those stations to serve you, to pray with you, for whatever need you have. There's a station in the center if you want to come alone, take your own communion, tear a chunk off the bread, dip it in the juice, consume, remembering the broken body and the shed blood. And again, if you'd like to pray, you can kneel down here during this closing time. If you'd like someone to pray for you, then go to one of those other 3 stations. Last thing, if you're here and you're a believer, this meal is for you to remember what Jesus did. You're at that place where you're like, man, I'm a believer. I'm trusting. Here's what this doesn't mean. This doesn't mean you're perfect. This doesn't mean that because you said, yep, I follow Jesus, that your life is all together. In fact, in some regard, this actually means that you go, I recognize that my life is actually a real big fat wreck. And that you're recognizing how much you need the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus over your life. And you're doing that in remembrance always. That you don't got this on your own. That Jesus got this on the cross when he said, this is finished. I completed this. And you just walk in that. So you don't have to be a member of our church, but you do need to be a believer. And that could have happened 15 seconds ago or 15 years ago. just love to serve you that way. I'd like to invite you into participating that way as a family. So I want to invite you guys to stand with me as we close.
How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure. How great the pain of searing loss, the Father turns His face away, as wounds which mar the chosen one bring many sons to glory. Behold, man upon a cross, my sin upon His shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers. It was my sin that held Him there until it was accomplished. His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished. I will not boast in anything, no gifts, no power, no wisdom, but I will boast in Jesus Christ, His death and resurrection. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. Why should I gain from His reward? I cannot give an answer, but this I know with all my heart: His wounds have paid my ransom. His wounds have paid my ransom. Before the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads.
written on his heart. I know that while in heaven he stands, no tongue can bid me thence depart. No tongue can bid me thence depart. When Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the guilt within, upward I look and see him there, who made an end to all my sin. Because the sinless Savior died, my sinful soul is counted free. For God the just is satisfied to look on him and pardon me, to look on him and pardon me. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Behold him there, the risen Lamb, my perfect spotless righteousness, the great unchangeable I am, the King of glory and of grace, one with himself. I cannot die. My soul is purchased by his blood. My life is hid with Christ on high, with Christ my Savior and my God, with Christ my Savior and my God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the one risen Son of God.
Amen, right? Praise the one, the risen Son of God. Christ is the center of our worship, is meant to be, and yet, as we've learned again today, how easy it is to get moved off that center, right? My prayer for us as we go is that God would continue to bring you back around to that center. Christ's work at the cross, finished. His work at the tomb, empty, powerful. That you get to now go forward throughout the week and walk in that power. That the truth of the gospel would continue to motivate you, transform you, and change you. That's the benediction that I'd want to speak over us today as we go. And that also as you go, you would remember that there is an entire community, in fact, an entire world outside these walls that we all walk in, that God would like to work through you. So it's not just God's work in you, changing and transforming you, but that He would work through you in changing and transforming the world. Amen? So that not just you and I would come and worship Him in spirit and in truth, proclaiming, praise the one risen Son of God, but that others would also come to that place. So as you go this week, it's a commission to you to be on the lookout for the way that God might use you in those roles. And also to be thinking about the way that you might stay connected to a church family as you go. That being part of a church family is not just about the Sunday morning experience, but that it's also about being in community throughout the week. The reality is that that's a priority change for many of us, especially in our culture where Sunday morning is where the church happens. In fact, we go to the church, right? I would suggest rather than going to the church, how about be the church? Part of that means we gather throughout the week in gospel community. It's a sacrifice. You're going to give your time for that. And there's also a way in which God works in you through that. So I just want to invite you to be in gospel community throughout this week. There's a number of them that meet throughout our community, so come and talk to me afterwards. You want to jump in one. Also, if you're a visitor with us, fill out a connection card or a first impression survey. They look like this. They're out there on the welcome table. We do have one more song as we close, but I recognize that we've kept you here for 2 hours, minus 5 minutes because we started 5 minutes late. So if you'd like to stay and worship with this last song, great. If you need to get going, no guilt, no shame. Get on out of here if you need to go. Love you guys. We'll see you next week. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Our God is a consuming fire, burning holy flame with glory and freedom. Our God is the only righteous judge, ruling over us with kindness and wisdom. We will keep our eyes on you. We will keep our eyes on you. A mighty fortress is our God. A sacred refuge is your name. Your kingdom is unshakable. With you forever we will reign. Our God is jealous for His own. None could comprehend His love and His mercy. Our God is exalted on His throne, high above keeper